This is episode 76 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Hebron, head of drama at Winchester College and author of Prospero, a Renaissance Magus for the British Library. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
One that actually particularly interests me is Hotspur. After he's died, in Henry IV Part 2, his widow describes him as speaking thick. And then she goes on to say, which nature made his blemish. So she's explicitly saying there's a blemish on his speech. There's something wrong with it. So this is a problem, a disability. But this idiosyncrasy becomes fashionable. So she says, quotes, those that could speak low and tardily would turn their own perfection to abuse to seem like him.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare's presentation of Richard III portrays the king as a villain, with a great focus on his hunchback and other disabilities as a justification and contributing factor to Richard's malignment morally. For centuries, historians have wondered if the late king really was as twisted as legend has rendered him to be, or if the tales were merely the product of centuries of conflation born out of the winter of a collective discontent. Other kinds of disabilities, from Pistol's mispronunciation of Irish Gaeilic in response to a French question being asked in Henry V, to questions of madness and mental stability from characters like King Lear. With the advent of hospitals like Bedlam Hospital to treat mental disorders in England, as well as the very first occupational health scheme established in 1599, Shakespeare's lifetime was full of questions and diverse answers concerning what a disability was and how to address it as a society and as an individual living with disease or impairment. Here today to help us explore the world of regional accents in a dialogue-based theater, the twisted spine and subsequent hunchback of King Richard III, as well as the historical opinions, hospitals, and medical treatments available for those living with a wide range of disabilities in the 16th century, is our guest, Dr. Susan Anderson. Susan is principal lecturer in English and deputy head of English at Sheffield Hallam University. She is also the co-editor of Bloomsbury Cultural History of Disability, Thomas Heywood's Lord Mayor's Shows from 1631 to 1639. Her research focuses on disability in early modern drama, looking at the ways different bodies and minds are described in the early modern period and also how they might have been portrayed on stage. Her book, Echo and Meaning on Early Modern English Stages, traces the way sound and music contributed to performance across the period. Hello, Susan. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So in 2012, the actual remains of King Richard III, like the real ones, were discovered by researchers at the University of Leicester. After subsequent analysis, what has the academic community concluded about the twisted spine of King Richard III? Was he actually physically maligned, as Shakespeare's led us to believe?
Right, yeah. So the answer here, I think, really depends on whether you're an archaeologist, whether you're a historian, whether you're a literary scholar, or maybe even a fan of Richard III, as all of those kinds of people are interested in quite different things. So I think the discovery of those remains offered something different to all those people. And I often tell my students to remember that Shakespeare's Richard is a fictional character. So yeah, he's based on a historical person, but he isn't real. Like, he didn't say those things.
Yes.
So he's effectively a different person. I think you need to bear that in mind. So strictly speaking, from that perspective, you could say, well, the discovery of the historical remains isn't actually relevant at all. You know, that's a different person. But I think if you're interested in disability, the relationship between what we now know about the historical Richard's body and then how that body is actually demonized in the play shows us something really about the negative power of the use of disability as a metaphor. So disability and physical deformity is being used to attack and to denigrate, and that negativity about that disability reflects back onto the form of disability that's being invoked, right? So it creates a stereotype, and it's not a very nice stereotype.
Just to be clear, though, are we saying that the strict yes or no answer to whether or not the actual King Richard III was physically maligned, is that a yes, he was?
So by maligned, do you mean sort of...
was his spine really twisted?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. So the person whose remains was dug up, he had scoliosis of the spine. So that probably would have shown up in the way that he walked and his physicality.
Were these conditions like scoliosis and even maybe spina bifida, they're often theorized as the source of Richard's curved spine. And I know we're making there is a delineation, and you're right, between Shakespeare's version of Richard III and the real man who lived in history. But for the sake of conversation, they are often theorized as the source of Richard's curved spine. What were they common elements in Renaissance England? So when Shakespeare was describing Richard III with a twisted spine, would there have been an understanding of scoliosis then?
Well, yeah. So these conditions have always been around. Whether they're more or less common is kind of difficult to tell, because they're a combination of genetics and environment. So, spina bifida is caused by not having enough folic acid. Well, it increases the chance. Not having enough folic acid during pregnancy increases the chance. So clearly, people's diet, people's cultural circumstances, the kind of understanding at the time does change the likelihood of mothers, having babies with, let's say, scoliosis or spina bifida. But the way that that's understood is very different. So it must have happened, and we know that it did happen.
Were there treatments available for people who suffered from these kinds of physical disabilities?
Yeah, there were, but quite different from today. So
I'm sure.
Yeah, the medical orthodoxy of the day. I think you could do a whole episode on humoral theory, because this is the kind of system of belief that underpins medicine in Shakespeare's time. It's about to shift, so there's about to be the scientific revolution, but at this point there's still this idea that there's a balance in the body between the different humours, and disease is caused by an imbalance, so an excess of bile, or a body that is too hot or too cold or too dry. So medical treatment tries to redress that balance, and that's where you get bloodletting, right? So you've got too much blood, so let's get rid of that.
Always a fun one, Can you imagine going to the doctor and having to be like, and guess what we have to do today?
Yeah, again, this remedy for pretty much everything. But it wasn't always quite that grisly. So you might sort of try to change your diet, for example. So if you were sort of too hot in your temperament, then you might try and eat cooling foods like lettuce or something like that to try and help redress that balance. So it wasn't always quite as gruesome as bloodletting.
They didn't try to solve a curved spine by telling people to eat lettuce.
No. So that's just in terms of more general kind of sources that we have that talk about medical treatments. They tend to be these big compendia of kind of cobbled together references from ancient Greek sources, but then also, a particular person's notes. So they tend to also be quite contradictory. So you'll see, for example, the work I did on stuttering. It turns out that stuttering, some people say it's caused by being too dry. So you need to drink wine to try and remedy that. But then other writers say, no, it's because you're too moist. So the kind of opposite remedy is suggested for exactly the same thing. So there are treatments available. I wouldn't say that there was a clear kind of medical procedure or shared sense of what you do in this situation. It's a bit Wild West out there, really, as far as,
because they're still figuring it all out and deciding exactly,
Yeah, and they think it's all based on the humours, so
exactly
they're set off on that path, and they're determined to stick to it for quite some time.
Now, what about places like Bedlam Hospital? I know as England's first mental hospital, what were the realities of mental disabilities in England when Shakespeare was writing several of his plays? We know King Lear appears to go mad, for example, as well as Margaret in Richard III, which leads us to wonder what kind of understanding did Shakespeare have about various medical conditions of the mind?
Yeah, so I think Shakespeare is really fascinated by the mind and different states of mind. Thinking that, we need to think humourally here as well. So mental illness in the period is considered within the same sphere as physical illness. So it's caused by a kind of imbalance, and that there's a link between the mind and the body, which is really interesting because I think that's kind of coming back. This idea that your mental state affects your physical health. That
is a very modern process.
So maybe they weren't all completely wrong about that. So they're kind of interlinked. But then there are also some, having said that, we might recognise some of that, there are some real differences. So madness as a term is one of these kind of extremely vague things that you sort of think you know what it means. But as soon as you start to think, okay, well, what does that really look like? How can we define that? It's very difficult to pin down. And in Shakespeare, it's put to so many different uses. I think really it operates as a kind of marker of exclusion. So when somebody is behaving as if they're mad, or somebody is described as mad, that's about, oh, they're strange, there's something wrong, they're not one of us, that's excluding them. So I think that's the sort of general thing about the term mad. I think in terms of particular characters, I think one thing I've been really interested in is the way that that's described in King Lear. So there's a bit in King Lear where Gloucester says that his son's betrayal hath crazed my wits. So there's two things to think about there. Madness is a kind of response to this unsupportably traumatic thing that's happened to him, but also that the mind is something that can be broken in that way. So when he says it's crazed, he's not using it in the modern term of crazy, which of course is a term we would never use because that's not acceptable. He's using it as a verb. So he's saying my mind has been crazed by this, and that's really to break or to shatter. So he's saying that mind is something that has a wholeness to it that can be physically broken if you are going through these external events that are so traumatizing that they're kind of like physical blows that can inflict a kind of damage on the structure of the mind. So just these kind of quite casual references to characters who are sort of describing their experience can show us quite an interesting way of conceptualizing the mind as a kind of physical object in that way.
And I don't have the medical history to know this for sure, but that kind of reasoning sounds a lot like a modern understanding of conditions like PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and the idea that there are traumatizing events that can damage the mind. So they were pretty forward-thinking, at least progressive, maybe we can call them.
Well, I'm not sure I would ever say progressive. I think they're onto something.
They're okay. We'll say that. Yeah. That's a better way. Okay. Well, when Shakespeare uses terms like idiot, fool, or innocent, which I believe didn't always necessarily mean free of guilt, but rather someone of questionable judgment, but it could also represent the idea of rash behavior, as particularly the word fool has come to mean today. But instead, were these words ever used to be describing someone with learning disabilities like ADHD or even autism? Was there an understanding of those things when Shakespeare was writing?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. So these words, they're like, when you're learning a foreign language, they're like the false friends. They look like words that you know, but they actually mean something different. So there is evidence that individuals with Down syndrome and other kind of congenital disabilities did get employed as court fools in the past. So it's clear that the word court fool or the word fool could be referring to someone like that. But it's also true that the court fool could be a professional persona that's part of someone's employment. And it's really difficult to tell the difference because records of most people's lives are very scant. So where these people show up, sometimes there's evidence to suggest, it sounds like they probably had Downs. Sometimes it's like clearly this person is an actor who's doing this as part of a kind of broader kind of entertainment career. So in terms of learning disabilities and spectrum disabilities like ADHD and autism, it's even more complicated because, of course, like I said earlier, disability arises as an interaction between the kind of context of a person and their embodiment. So people in the past must have had the same kind of variations in brain development and chemistry and genetics and so on. We know that. That's just human variation. But how that then manifests itself, how people responded to them, how they made their way in the world is very different. So a clear example of that, I think, is dyslexia. If you've never had the opportunity to learn to read, how would you even know? What would dyslexia even be a thing to you? It wouldn't. So some disabilities actually come into being when industrialization and capitalism it changed society's expectations of what individuals are supposed to be able to do within a certain time frame, or to have learned certain things by a particular age. So, but having said that, I don't think that means we shouldn't be looking for those traces of those disabilities in the past, because I think it's important for all of us to see people that we identify with in histories and the literature that we encounter. So I think there must have been a full range of people with all kinds of disabilities in the past, but sometimes it's just a little bit difficult to kind of pick out where they are. And the great thing about Shakespeare is that we can choose to read that into some of these characters. So maybe they aren't real people, so it doesn't matter if we get it wrong. And if we want to, cast an actor with disabilities to play a particular role, that brings something really interesting and new to that role and shows us something new about Shakespeare and new about our understanding of disability. So that's why Shakespeare's so great.
Lameness is another disability that comes in Shakespeare's play. When Shakespeare mentions it in As You Like It, Adam says, quote, "When service should in my old limbs lie lame." That's from Act 2, Scene 3 of the play. Susan writes that this line indicates Adam does not expect reciprocal care for his lameness. Susan, is your research suggesting that being able to receive care for an abnormality like lameness, which resulted naturally from age, was only available to people of a certain social class?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely my feeling about the play. I think lameness is another one like madness, that it's really vague. What does he mean? Does he mean he's limping? Does he mean that he's lost a leg? There's a whole range of things that it could be, and they could be permanent, they could be temporary. I think Adam uses it to sort of generically refer to age-related disability, some sort of incapacity from doing the physical labour that's required of him. And I think he demonstrates the intersection between class and disability in a really particular way. So he's an able-bodied man for most of his life. And in doing that, he's been able to conform to this kind of proto-capitalist work ethic. So he's working hard, he's saving part of his wages, so he's going to be able to retire. He doesn't expect anyone else to look after him. And so he's kind of subscribing to this ideal of independence. But of course, he's not in that kind of society. He's in a kind of weird feudal relationship with Orlando's family. And then that comes into conflict with this ethic of service. So he's obliged to put the interests of his masters first and foremost at all times. So that's what makes him such a good servant. He's so loyal that he's instantly like, okay, here's my life savings. So what happens then, of course, is that Orlando, in this kind of idealised Forest of Arden scenario that we're in the play, he supports him in return. So he quite literally carries him famously at one point in the play. So he's returning that kind of loyalty that's the ideal of this mutual support. And then we see that reflected elsewhere. Duke Senior offers them sustenance in the forest. So I think the Forest of Arden is this idealised place where this kind of ethic of service works because it is reciprocal. But of course, it's intensely hierarchical. So I think there's this kind of utopian vision here that's deeply, deeply conservative. It's really based in, okay, I'm the master, you're the servant. As long as we do exactly what we're supposed to do, stay in our places, then we'll look after each other. Honestly, it's all going to work fine, And so the Forest of Arden shows us this place where that could work. But as a kind of model for assistance, there's something I always worry a little bit about Adam, and so don't you think you want to keep
poor Adam? Don't go
you
into
might need it. Yeah.
In 1618, which admittedly is 2 years after Shakespeare died, it's a little bit after his life, but Thomas Speller married Sarah Earle in London in what is known as the first marriage to have taken place in sign language. I call attention to this because there are notes from the ceremony that describe how Thomas Speller, quote, made signs as best he could to indicate that he wanted to be married. So he was making hand motions to communicate. Susan, today, the idea of someone who is deaf being limited in their participation in society seems far removed from our consciousness, at least my consciousness. It didn't occur to me that there would be that kind of limitation. But for William Shakespeare, this was obviously very different. And what would it have been like to be deaf and living in London?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not sure it's so far removed. I mean, we had a story very recently here in the UK about the very first person who was deaf to be allowed to serve on a jury in a criminal trial. So there's clearly progress still to be made in terms of ensuring everybody's got full access to citizenship. So there are these barriers, but there are these accommodations that can be made. So clearly that's what's going on in this marriage ceremony. They're saying, okay, well, maybe you can't speak the marriage vows. Let's find a way of making that possible for you in another way. So there are accommodations being made, but there's a huge variation, I think, in people's experience. So we've got evidence of people being excluded from inheritance. So this shows up because there's money involved, right? And so we have records of older sons who would normally be expected to inherit, being disinherited because they were deaf, and then that meant that they weren't able to speak. So we know that happened. But then, of course, on the other hand, there are these evidences of accommodations like the wedding. People are prepared to understand alternative ways of communicating as valid rather than insisting on a certain form. And this is really important in the kind of theological context as well, because this is the period where kind of certain theological doctrines are developing the idea that hearing the word of God, which you interpret very strictly, very literally, well, that excludes deaf people. Deaf people cannot be saved. If in order to be saved, you must hear the word of God. So the elect, the community of those saved by God, could potentially be barred to deaf people. And this caused some kind of discussion amongst hearing people, it has to be said, about what are we going to do about this. So we have this sort of really kind of problematic, worrying, exclusionary stuff that's clearly happening at the same time as examples of evidence that show that some form of sign language was certainly in use in the period. There's plenty of evidence of that, and that there are these examples where people are open enough to say, well, this is a form of communication and it's valid and it doesn't have to be just in one particular way.
Susan writes in her book about speech abnormalities in the 17th century, citing a story from the King James Bible in Judges, where a character is asked to say a particular word. It says, quote, "Say now shibboleth. And he said sibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him and slew him at the passages of the Jordan." Susan, obviously there's a great deal of backstory here, including biblical history that's valuable to understanding this excerpt as a whole. But since you used it to comment on the state of things in Shakespeare's England, I have to point out that this story makes it sound as if this man was executed for having a lisp. Would there have been people in the 17th century who were put to death if they were unable to speak properly?
Okay, well, no. So in this case, he's put to death in the biblical story because his pronunciation marks him out as a member of a particular ethnic group. So this is actually a kind of a story of a kind of genocide, right? What interested me about this anecdote and the way it's used is that writers in the period who are interested in language turn to this story when they're looking for a precedent for the way that different ways of speaking map onto different populations. So this is a really violent story, and Gardner, the writer in this case, just kind of totally skates over that. He's not interested at all. He just wants to say, look, you can tell all of this about a person just by listening to the way that they speak. What they say isn't important. The way that they say it tells you where they're from, who they are, whether they're a good person or not. So in terms of the possibility of being put to death because you have a lisp, it's not quite that straightforward. But there are writers suggesting, well, if somebody's stammering and you're accusing them of a crime, they've probably done it, right? That's why they're stammering. So the manner in which something is said is really seen as giving that kind of information. So there's something about the risks of speaking in the wrong way, speaking at the wrong moment, which maps very interestingly onto theorizations of disability, because it's that combination of something that's about the physical mechanics of the body. Like, you can't change your voice so easily. You have to speak in the way that you speak. But it's also culturally generated. You know, we learn speech from those around us. We learn our accent. We learn our language from those around us. So it's got this really interesting mixture of the kind of bodily, physical things that you can't do anything about, and this kind of malleable cultural effect and generation of the way that we speak.
This is personal for me. I make a very clear connection with that because I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, which is the southern United States, and we are famous for our accents down here in the way we speak. But there are a lot of cultural associations with what a person is like if they have that kind of accent, as opposed to speaking like the Queen, for example.
Yeah.
Very distinct accent in the way that she talks. And so there are, people make associations with the way that people sound. So it makes complete sense to me that it would have been that way for Shakespeare as well. Now, Susan writes about a man named Geoffrey Goodman in 1616 who wrote about language diversity. It was Goodman's opinion that language diversity had a biblical precedent for being a punishment upon society, saying, quote, "In the same tongue you shall observe a great diversity of dialects." Susan then describes a French writer in 1598 who specifically attributed an association between location, speech, and one's class or intelligence, which is what we're talking about with the accent and the different things that people put together with the way somebody sounds. This French writer is quoted in her paper saying, quote, "The more the people are in the South, the more they speak from within the stomach, and with heart, and with a voice full of consonants, without vowels, brusquely pronounced, and with many aspirations, because of the force and nature of the spirits which are very present there, and from the impetuosity of the intense heat. But those who inhabit the Southern Hemisphere and the Midi, who have their body heat tempered and their minds weakened, pronounce softly." Oh my goodness. Susan, we've seen the opinion of regional accents indicating the intelligence or strong-mindedness of a person, not only in things like the concept of a foreign or non-native speaker having an accent, but that reality of regional divisions and associated reputations continues in England specifically even today. For example, we talked about the Queen's English, but the Cockney accent is not considered as well-educated as received pronunciation. Whether or not that's true, people hold that association. And even in Shakespeare circles, the way a word is pronounced on stage has strong implications. And for Shakespeare, was there this distinction around regional accents in the 16th century?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Particularly the regional accents of the characters from different parts of what is now the UK, but was not then. So the Welsh, the Irish, the Scottish characters. And again, there's a lot of stereotyping going on there. So, yeah, I think he also uses speech diversity in quite artificial ways. So there's this, every high school student's favourite essay point, which is the class difference between characters who speak in verse and those who speak in prose. So we've got this, high class characters speak in verse, everybody knows that, and so he's very sensitive to these kind of nuances of accent, but also rhythms and the way in which someone's speaking. There's also the language learning scenes in Henry V, which are, they're played for comic value, but they show us a lot about those characters, about Catherine and Henry. One that actually particularly interests me is Hotspur. So he's described, after he's died, in Henry IV Part 2, his widow describes him as speaking thick. And then she goes on to say, which nature made his blemish. So she's explicitly saying there's a blemish on his speech, there's something wrong with it. So this is a problem, a disability. But this idiosyncrasy becomes fashionable. So she says, quotes, "Those that could speak low and tardily would turn their own perfection to abuse to seem like him." So people are copying his speech impediment because, well, he's cool, they want to be like him. And then, so then that's something really interesting, because what does she mean by speaking thick? Because actors and directors then look at that description and read it back into Part 1 when they're creating the character of Hotspur. And okay, so he's supposed to have a speech impediment. Now, we might expect that to mean speaking thick to mean slow, right? So often there's a bit of a stage tradition of him speaking with a stutter. But this actually isn't correct in terms of the kind of literal reading. Well, my interpretation of that moment, I think speaking thick should be read as meaning speaking too fast. Because she says those who could speak low and tardily are the ones who then change the way they speak. So they speed up their speech to try and sound like him. So it's like, I don't know, his words come thick and fast. We still have that kind of expression.
Yes.
So I think that's such a good example of the pressures that go into creating disability, right? So those who speak in ways that are outside perceived norms are treated differently. He's got a speech impediment. This is seen as a disability by his wife, but it's because it's not normal. But what is normal changes. So speaking too quickly for Lady Percy is like, that's wrong. That's going against her expectations of good speech. Whereas nowadays, when we're thinking, okay, we want a character who doesn't speak well, we have him stuttering and speaking too slowly. So it's completely the opposite. So the disability is both the way in which he speaks, but also the attitudes of those around him. And to the extent that this character's disability reverses, So he, at the time, he was speaking too quickly. Oh dear, terrible. People who speak too quickly, that's such a blemish. Whereas now we don't seem to have a problem with that so much. It doesn't make sense to audiences. So instead, we have a character who struggles to speak slowly.
That's interesting. I'm so going to watch that on stage now. Every time I see this, I'm like, okay, how do they handle Hotspur?
Yeah.
During the reign of Elizabeth I, specific hospitals were set up to care for soldiers who had returned from war, missing limbs or other body parts from their time in battle. There was one small hospital considered to be for, quote, maimed soldiers, set up in 1599 in Berkshire, with similar hospitals following suit in Chelsea, Greenwich, and others throughout the late 17th century. Additionally, just 2 years before we think Shakespeare wrote Richard III, and I think I'm pronouncing this possibly wrongly, but Chatham Chest was established to pay pensions to disabled seamen. Did I say that right?
Chatham, yeah.
Okay. That fund has been described as the world's first occupational health scheme. Susan, was there a distinction made by society and even the government between the source of various disabilities and the subsequent worthiness of people who possess them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The history of disability is bound together, unfortunately, with the history of poverty and with society's response to it, and the changing ways in which the idea of charity and social obligation have been constructed. So the Elizabethan Poor Laws went some way to kind of codifying and regulating how communities could and should deal with vagrants and indigent people and people who are in need of support, or just people who are in need of anything, really. And this is all part of the kind of consequences of the upheaval of the Reformation. So many of the social structures designed to deal with poverty had been upended. The doctrine of good works, on which a lot of charitable activity was based, was challenged by the notion of salvation by faith alone. So that doesn't mean that support's not available, but it's just being structured in different ways. Individuals had to petition for relief. So organisations like the Royal Navy did have schemes like the Chatham Chest, which sailors themselves paid into. So that's what's so unusual about it, is that it's a sort of insurance policy that they themselves are paying into. More usually, it would be the local parish authorities or a livery company or a trading company whose records show that people who'd been injured in the line of work or had become ill would then ask for support based on their record of service. And so you see the insidious kind of creeping in of these decisions are being made on the basis not of what people need so much as what it's perceived that they deserve. So are they hardworking? Did they contribute to the company? Did they work hard for us? Are they moral? Are they worthy of pity? And this, unfortunately, I think we kind of have, this is very familiar to us today, that a sense that people need to prove that they're worthy of support rather than seeing that we're all interdependent. Nobody is an island. We can't continue to live without some support from each other, and that we all have responsibility for each other. We all have something to bring. So just because somebody's got a disability doesn't mean they're not just as much part of our community. So from my perspective, I think Shakespeare's era is really where we see the development of institutionalised and systematised support, which is designed to reduce the cost of supporting disabled people rather than focusing on what support they need. And it does that by stigmatising support. So asking for support is stigmatised, it's abnormal, disability is different, it's a different kind of support. So the kinds of things that we might take for granted, wearing glasses, being commonly available for people with short-sightedness like myself, that's completely normalised. Nobody bats an eyelid. But other forms of support, like having a wheelchair, that's out of the ordinary and strange. And actually, they're all part of the same spectrum. We all need something. And also we see that, again, another unfortunate parallel between now and then is that people were absolutely obsessed with the idea of fake disability. So is this person who is asking for something from me just putting it on? And the reason why I say that is that is the most common form of disability that we see on the stage, is somebody faking disability in order to trick someone or to gain some advantage. And I think that if we're not careful, that gives us a really skewed portrayal of what it living with different kinds of bodies, different kinds of minds might have been like in the period.
This whole concept of disability and how it was thought of and treated and interacted with for Shakespeare's lifetime is a vast topic that I know we would love to learn more about. So what are your favorite books and resources that you can recommend we use to learn more?
Okay, so the sort of foundational text that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in disability and literature is Narrative Prosthesis by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder. That's a great one. There's lots of stuff about Richard III in there, so that's a great one to start with. There's also Rosemary Garland Thompson's Extraordinary Bodies. That's another sort of key foundational literary disability text. But thinking more specifically about early modern disability and Shakespeare, there's a collection by Alison Hopgood and David Houston Wood called Recovering Disability in Early Modern England. And there's also a collection edited by Sujata Iyengar called Disability, Health and Happiness in the Shakespearean Body. And those are all fantastic books with such interesting contributions that I'm sure, as soon as you started, you want to find out more when you read any of those.
We will definitely link to all of these in today's show notes. Thank you for these recommendations. We ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so this choice would be in addition to those.
Great. Okay, so this is such a hard question, isn't it? But I think I would sort of choose a little bit in that I want an omnibus edition of all of the Earthsea novels by Ursula Le Guin. So if we can have them all in one book, I think that counts as one book.
Yes, I think it does. Yes, you can have them all in one book. Yes.
Yeah.
What an
because I love her writing. I think, and she can sort of take you to different places. Even if you're stuck on a desert island, you can imagine that you're in this magical land. Travel in your mind.
You'll be well set up there on your deserted island for sure. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm developing my work on stuttering. So I'm trying to sort of gather more examples of stuttering characters and find out more about them and how that works on stage. And a little bit adjacent to Shakespeare, I think it's particularly in the work of John Marston that we find characters with speech impediments. So that's what I'm going to be working on.
This has been a really fun look at what disabilities meant for Shakespeare. Susan Anderson, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. This has been an interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's been so much fun.
To add your own voice to this conversation with your thoughts about disabilities in Shakespeare's England, be sure to check out today's show notes. Not only will you find a place to leave your comments, but there is extra history packed in there with links to the resources Susan recommended for when you want to explore deeper into the history of today's topic. Find all the good stuff over at CassidyCash.com/episode 76. That's CassidyCash.com/EP76. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.